Silas Thorne was mending a fishing net in the creeping damp of his tiny hovel. The scent of rain on dust and the deeper, more permanent smell of mildew were the only constants in his life. He knew the rules of his village, Blackwood. They were unspoken but carved into the heart of every soul born there. Rule 1, mind your own business. Rule 2, pay your debts to the letter, especially to a man like Howell Critch. And especially, above all else, Rule 3. If you saw an orc, you ran, or you screamed, or you grabbed a pitchfork. You did not, under any circumstances, help. But when he followed the sound of a pained cry into the tangled woods bordering his property, he found her, an orc. A massive female, caught in a hunter's cruel iron snare, her leg mangled and bleeding. Beside her, a small orc child huddled, his large eyes wide with a terror that knew no language. And in that moment, seeing a mother desperate and a child afraid, Silas Thorne broke the most important rule of all, and that choice changed everything. The air in the forest was thick and heavy, each breath a swallow of wet earth and decaying leaves. The snare was a wicked thing, rusted but strong, its teeth biting deep into the orc's calf. Her skin, the color of mossy stone, was stained dark with blood that dripped onto the forest floor, a grim offering to the soil. She had stopped struggling, her immense strength finally giving way to the draining reality of pain and exhaustion. Her breathing was a ragged, guttural sound, a storm trapped in her chest. Silas stood frozen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every story he'd ever been told screamed at him. Orcs were monsters. Savages. They raided villages, burned homes, and their laughter was the sound of splitting bone. Frathrak Skullrender and his horde had ravaged the northern settlements just last season, and the tales told by the refugees were stitched from pure nightmare. This female could be one of them. A scout, a straggler from some vile war party. His hand tightened on the handle of the rusty woodsman's axe he carried. It was his only real tool, used for chopping the meager firewood that kept the chill from his bones. It was not a weapon. He was not a warrior. He was a mender of nets, a man whose shoulders stooped from the invisible weight of a debt he had inherited from his father, and his father before him. Poverty was a dampness that had seeped into his very marrow. He looked from the axe to the orc. Her head was bowed, but she watched him from under a heavy, sweat-dampened brow. There was no malice in her eyes, only a profound, bone-deep weariness and a guarded, defiant pain. Then his gaze fell to the child. The little one, no bigger than the baker's boy, was pressed against his mother's side, his small hands clutching her leather tunic. He wasn't crying. His silence was somehow worse. A hollow vessel filled with a fear too great for sound. Silas saw not a monster's spawn, but a child, a terrified child hiding behind his mother. And he saw a mother who would die before she let anything harm him. The rules of Blackwood faded. The fearful stories became just that, stories. What stood before him was not a monster from a tale, it was suffering. And his fatal strength, the one that kept him poor and perpetually on the edge of ruin, was his utter inability to walk away from suffering. He couldn't ignore a stray dog with a broken leg, or a bird with a torn wing. How could he ignore this? He took a slow step forward. The orc female tensed, a low growl vibrating in her throat. It was a warning, but it was weak, desperate. "I'm not going to hurt you," Silas said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the oppressive silence of the woods. He held up his empty hands, showing he meant no harm, then slowly lowered himself to one knee. He pointed at the snare. "That looks bad." She watched him, her intelligent eyes tracking his every move. She said nothing. The child flinched, hiding his face in his mother's tunic. Silas knew he had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. Helping her meant bringing danger to his doorstep. The hunter who set this trap would be back. The village, if they found out, would brand him a traitor. Howell Critch would find some way to use it against him, to tighten the noose of debt already around his neck. Ignoring her meant leaving her to die, or to be captured, and likely killed for a bounty. It meant leaving a child to watch his mother perish. He thought of his own mother, how her face had grown gaunt and weary from hunger in the winter before she passed. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, of watching someone you love fade away while the world remained cold and indifferent. He couldn't do it. He couldn't be that indifferent. "All right," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "All right." He moved with painstaking slowness, never taking his eyes off her. He laid his axe on the ground, well away from him. Then he crawled toward the trap. The mechanism was old but simple. A pressure plate and a powerful spring. He needed a lever. He looked around, his eyes scanning the forest floor until he found a sturdy, fallen branch. The orc watched, her massive form utterly still. She could have lunged. Even with her injury, she could have crushed his skull with one blow. But she didn't. She simply watched, her breath hitching every time a wave of pain washed over her. Silas jammed the end of the branch into the jaws of the snare. He put all of his thin, wiry weight onto it, his muscles screaming in protest. The metal groaned. Rust flaked away. For a moment, nothing happened. The trap was stronger than he was. His arms trembled, sweat stinging his eyes. He gritted his teeth, a pain sound escaping his own lips. Then, with a sudden, sharp crack, the jaws shuddered and spread. Just an inch. But it was enough. "Pull," he grunted, the single word tight with effort. "Pull your leg out, now!" With a guttural cry of agony, the orc wrenched her leg free. Blood welled from the deep, jagged wounds. She collapsed back against the tree, cradling her injured limb, her body shaking uncontrollably. The child rushed to her, pressing his face against her shoulder. Silas let the branch go. The trap snapped shut with a vicious clang that echoed through the woods. He was panting, his body slick with sweat. He had done it. He had freed her. Now what? He couldn't just leave her here. She couldn't walk. The hunter would still find her. The wolves would smell the blood. He looked at his hovel, barely visible through the trees. A leaking roof, an empty larder, a cold hearth. It wasn't much. It was barely shelter for one, but it was all he had. "Can you stand?" he asked. Fine, she tried. She pushed herself up, her jaw clenched, but her leg buckled instantly, and she fell back with a sharp intake of breath. Her pride was a palpable thing, a shield she held up even now, but her body had betrayed it. Silas took a deep breath. He was already an outcast, a man living on the fringe, defined by his poverty. What was one more transgression? "Here," he said, moving to her side. He was small, almost frail next to her broad, powerful frame. "Lean on me." She looked at him, and for the first time the guardedness in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. A human, a weak, small human, was offering her his shoulder. She had seen humans run. She had seen them fight. She had never seen one offer aid. Slowly, hesitantly, she looped a massive arm over his shoulders. The weight was immense. Silas staggered, his knees threatening to buckle. She was solid muscle and bone, built for war and hardship. He was built for mending nets. "Easy," he grunted, finding his footing. "One step at a time." The child, Grok, followed them, his eyes fixed on Silas. He stayed close to his mother, a silent, watchful shadow. The journey was an agonizing crawl. Every step sent a jolt of pain through the orc, and her weight pressed Silas into the soft earth. He could feel the heat of her body, the faint metallic scent of her blood. The reality of what he was doing settled in. He was bringing a monster home, his home. They finally reached the dilapidated shack he called a house. The door hung crookedly on one hinge. He pushed it open and helped her inside. The interior was a single, small room, shadowed and smelling of damp wood and cold ash. A threadbare cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-spun blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, crude table and a single chair stood in the center. It was the physical embodiment of poverty. He guided her to the cot, and she sank onto it, her face pale beneath its green tint. She immediately pulled her son close, her protective instincts overriding her pain. Silas moved to the hearth. He had a few pieces of wood left. He arranged them carefully, striking his flint and steel until a tiny spark caught on the tinder. Soon, a small, hungry fire began to lick at the wood, pushing back the shadows and offering a meager warmth. He took the small pot that hung by the fire and filled it with water from his bucket. He had a handful of wild onions and the last of a stale loaf of bread. It was his dinner for the next 2 days. Without hesitation, he chopped the onions and crumbled the bread into the pot, setting it over the flames to heat. It wasn't much, but a warm broth was better than nothing. While it heated, he turned his attention to her leg. "I need to clean that," he said. "It will fester if I don't." Gaza watched him, her expression unreadable. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Silas ripped a strip from one of his few clean rags. He dipped it in the precious clean water and gently, carefully, began to clean the blood and dirt from the wound. The cuts were deep, torn by the rusty teeth of the trap. She hissed in pain as he worked, her hands clenching into fists, but she did not pull away. Grok watched his every move, his little face a mask of solemn concentration. When the wound was clean, Silas rummaged in a small wooden box. He pulled out a clay pot containing a pungent green salve his mother had taught him to make from comfrey and yarrow. It was good for wounds and broken bones. He had a tiny amount left. He applied it to her leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then he bound it tightly with more clean rags. He sat back on his heels, exhausted. The fire crackled, and the smell of the thin onion broth filled the small room. He ladled some into his only wooden bowl and held it out to her. "It's not much," he said, "but it's warm." Gaza looked at the bowl. She looked at the hovel, at the meager fire, at the threadbare blanket she sat on. She looked at this strange, small human who had freed her, carried her, tended her wound, and was now offering her the last of his food. She took the bowl. Her large calloused fingers brushed against his. She brought it to her lips and drank, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. Then she held it out for her son. Grok drank too, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. They shared the bowl, passing it back and forth until it was empty. A broken meal, shared between broken people. In the flickering firelight, Silas looked at the key that hung on a nail by the door. It was a simple, rusty iron key. It fit the lock on the door, a lock his father had installed with proud hands. But the house wasn't his. The land wasn't his. It all belonged to Howell Critch, a constant, looming reminder of his bondage. He was an outcast here, trapped by a debt he could never hope to pay. He looked at the orc mother and her child, exiles, refugees, hunted and trapped. In their own way, they were just as bound as he was. In the silence of the room, with the fire crackling and the rain beginning to patter against the leaky roof, a fragile, unspoken understanding began to form. They were different species, from different worlds, but in that moment, they were the same. They were the outcasts. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The first few days were a tense ballet of coexistence in a space too small for one, let alone three. Gaza was a being of immense physical presence, and the tiny hovel seemed to shrink around her. When she moved, the floorboards groaned in protest. When she slept, her deep, slow breaths filled the room, a constant reminder to Silas of the creature lying on his cot. He gave her the cot without a second thought, taking the cold, hard floor for himself, with only a thin, worn blanket for comfort. Sleep did not come easily. He'd lie awake, listening to the rain drip into the pot he'd placed under the worst leak in the roof. a steady, maddening rhythm counting out his poverty. He'd stare into the darkness and think about what he'd done. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach. The hunter who owned that trap would be checking it soon. Orc traps were not set for sport. They were set for bounties. Someone would come looking for their prize. Gaza, for her part, was a difficult patient. Her warrior nature chafed against the enforced stillness. She would test her injured leg constantly, her face a mask of stoic fury at its weakness. Silas would find her trying to stand, her knuckles white as she gripped the wall for support, a low growl of frustration rumbling in her chest. "You need to rest," he'd say, his voice gentle but firm. "The salve needs time to work. Time. You'll tear the wound open again." She would glare at him, her pride wounded more than her flesh. But she would sink back onto the cot, her gaze distant and stormy. Her silence was a heavy cloak she wore, and Silas did not try to pull it away. He simply continued his quiet routine. He mended his nets, he checked his meager snares for rabbits, they were always empty, and he shared what little food he had. One morning, Silas woke to a strange sound, a rhythmic thumping and scraping from outside. He sat up, his heart instantly pounding. He crept to the door, his hand reaching for his axe, and peered through a crack in the wood. He saw Gaza. She was on his roof. She had dragged his rickety ladder to the side of the hovel and, despite her still healing leg, had hauled herself up. She was moving with a grim determination, her powerful hands tearing away the old, rotten shingles that were the source of the constant leaks. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, even though she favored her injured leg heavily. Silas rushed outside, his voice a panicked whisper. "What are you doing? Get down from there. You'll fall. Your leg." She glanced down at him, her expression unyielding. "The roof is broken," she stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She held up a piece of rotten wood that crumbled in her grip. "It lets in the damp. Dampness breeds sickness." "I know it's broken," he hissed, looking around nervously at the tree line. I haven't had the coin for new shingles." Gaza grunted, a sound of dismissal. She didn't understand coin. She understood problems and solutions. The roof was a problem. She was the solution. She continued her work, her movements surprisingly precise for someone of her size. She found the weak spots, tore them out, and then, using salvaged planks Silas had been saving for firewood, she began to patch the holes. She didn't have nails, so she used her own strength, wedging the wood into place with such force that it held firm. Silas watched, dumbfounded. The task would have taken him a week of painstaking labor. She accomplished it in an hour. When she finally climbed down, her face was slick with sweat, but the set of her jaw was triumphant. She had contributed. She had begun to repay her debt. That night, when the rain came, the steady drip, drip, drip into the pot was gone. There was only the sound of the downpour against a solid roof. The silence inside the hovel was different. It was a dry silence, a warm silence. Silas looked over at Gaza, who sat by the fire, sharpening a small hunting knife with a whetstone she carried in her boot. A flicker of something new passed between them. Not just understanding, respect. The next day, she ventured into the woods. Silas protested, worried about her leg, but she waved him off. She returned a few hours later with her tunic full of things he had never known were edible. Knobby roots that, when roasted in the fire, tasted sweet and earthy. Dark, broadleaf plants that made a bitter but nourishing tea. A clutch of mushrooms he had always been told were poison. "These are not poison," she said, holding one up. "You cook them twice. The first water is bitter. The second is sweet." She prepared them herself, her large hands surprisingly deft. That night, they ate a meal that was almost filling. Silas felt the warmth of it spread through his belly, a sensation so unfamiliar it was almost alarming. For the first time in years, the gnawing ache of hunger was gone. Grok, the child, remained a silent observer. He would sit near the hearth, his dark eyes following Silas. He never spoke, not a single word. But one afternoon, while Silas was painstakingly restitching a tear in his worn cloak, Grok approached him. He held out his small hand. In his palm was a small, crudely carved figure of a bird, whittled from a piece of firewood. The wings were uneven, the head slightly lopsided, but it was unmistakably a bird. Silas looked from the carving to the boy's solemn face. He gently took the small gift. "Thank you," he said softly. "It's beautiful." Grok did not smile, but the tightness around his eyes seemed to lessen. He gave a single, small nod and retreated back to his mother's side. Gaza watched the exchange, and a rare, faint smile touched her lips. The fragile piece of their strange domestic life was not destined to last. Blackwood was a small village. Secrets had a short lifespan. It was Tom, the baker's son, who saw her. He had been chasing a stray chicken near the edge of the woods and had seen the towering green figure of Gaza splitting firewood with a single, contemptuous swing of Silas's axe. The boy had stood frozen for a second, his eyes wide, before turning and fleeing back to the village, screaming, "Monster!" The word spread like wildfire. It ignited the dry tinder of fear and prejudice that lay in the heart of the village. A monster. In Silas Thorne's hovel. The quiet, pathetic debtor at the edge of town was harboring a creature from their nightmares. By midday, the whispers had become a low, angry murmur. By evening, the first stone hit the side of the hovel. It struck the wood with a loud crack, making them all jump. Another followed, and then another. Silas rushed to the window, peering out. He could see a small crowd of villagers standing at a distance, their faces pale and fearful in the twilight. They held rocks and farm tools, their fear making them brave. "Go away!" Silas shouted through the door. "She's done nothing to you." "He's protecting it," someone yelled back. "He's brought a curse on us all." Gaza moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Her eyes were cold fire. "I can make them leave," she said, her voice a low growl. "No," Silas said immediately, putting a hand on her arm. "That will only make it worse. They're just scared." He spent the next hour nailing boards over the single small window, plunging the hovel into near-total darkness, save for the light of the fire. The stones continued to rain down for a time, a percussive rhythm of hatred, before the crowd finally dispersed, their courage failing as true night fell. The next morning brought a new kind of menace. Not the frightened, angry mob, but a single portly figure in a well-made wool coat, carrying a heavy leather-bound ledger. Hal Critch. Critch did not come to the door. He stood a prudent distance away, flanked by two burly men Silas recognized as hired muscle from the next town over. "Thorne!" Critch's voice was reedy, but carried an unmistakable tone of authority. "Silas Thorne, show yourself!" Silas opened the door a crack, his heart sinking. Critch's face was a mask of smug satisfaction. He had found his leverage. "Mr. Critch," Silas said, his voice flat. "I have received disturbing reports, Thorne," Critch said, tapping his ledger. "Reports of a violation of your tenancy agreement. A rather large, green, tusked violation, I believe. The agreement is quite clear. No livestock of an unusual nature. I believe this qualifies." "She's not livestock," Silas said through gritted teeth. "She's a guest." Critch laughed, a short, unpleasant bark. "A guest? Is that what you call it? Harboring a monster that has the entire village in a panic? That, Thorne, is a breach of the peace, a severe breach." He flipped open his ledger, his eyes gleaming. "According to my records, your family's debt stands at 482 silver pieces. An ancestral debt, a legacy of poor decisions." He looked up, his smile widening. "Given this egregious violation, I am invoking the acceleration clause. The full amount is due immediately." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. 482 silver pieces. He had never held more than 5 at one time in his entire life. It was an impossible sum. I can't pay that. I know, Critch said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Therefore, I have no choice but to issue a notice of eviction. You have 1 week, Thorn, 7 days, to pay the debt in full or vacate the premises, and take your guest with you. He snapped the ledger shut. The sound was like a judge's gavel. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his hired thugs falling into step behind him. Silas stood in the doorway, the world tilting around him. 1 week. He was going to lose the only home he had ever known, a place his family had lived for generations, all because of a single act of compassion. The dampness of poverty he had lived with his whole life was about to become the cold, hard reality of homelessness. He closed the door and leaned against it, the rough wood pressing into his back. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. Gaza stood behind him, her face grim. She had heard everything. This debt, she said, her voice low. This Critch. He uses it as a weapon. It's all he knows, Silas said wearily, sliding down to sit on the floor. His ledger is his world. That night, the hovel was filled with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of respect, but the heavy, suffocating silence of despair. Silas stared into the fire, seeing nothing but the end of his world. He had tried to do something good, and it had ruined him. Gaza watched him. She saw the stoop in his shoulders, the utter defeat in his eyes. This small man had faced down his fear to save her. He had shared his last crust of bread. He had defended her against his own people. And now, his world was crumbling because of it. He was not weak. His compassion was a form of strength she had never encountered, a strength far rarer than any warrior's prowess with a blade. It was a strength that deserved to be defended. She moved to sit on the floor across from him, the firelight casting deep shadows on her rugged features. Grok, feeling the shift in the atmosphere, crept from the cot and curled up in her lap, his head resting against her chest. In my clan, Gaza began, her voice soft, breaking the heavy silence. We do not have ledgers of coin, we have ledgers of honor. A warrior who breaks an oath is a greater debtor than one who cannot pay for his shield. She told him a piece of her story then. Not all of it, but enough. She spoke of the Bloodtusk clan, a proud and ancient line. She spoke of a warlord named Thrathrak, a brutal warrior who valued power above all else. He had risen through the ranks with savagery and cunning, and then, through treachery, had usurped the rightful leader. He had declared the true chieftain a traitor, a coward who had fled a battle, and had put a bounty on her head to cement his lie. He hunts me, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Not just to kill me, but to kill the truth of what he did. Silas listened, his own troubles momentarily forgotten, caught up in the ancient rhythm of her tale of honor and betrayal. He saw the weight she carried, a burden far heavier than his own monetary debt. You are a good man, Silas Thorn, she said, her gaze steady and intense. You have the heart of a chieftain, though your body is small. You took us in. You defended us. You have bound yourself to our fate. She reached out and placed her large hand over his heart. In my clan, when someone performs such an act, they are no longer an outsider. They are kin. A bond of honor is forged, stronger than blood, stronger than steel. He felt the warmth of her hand through his thin shirt. He looked at her, at the fierce loyalty in her eyes. He looked at the sleeping child in her arms. He looked at the walls of his hovel, a place he was about to lose, and he realized he didn't care about the house anymore. He cared about the family that was now inside it. A broken, strange, and unlikely family. His family. The despair in his heart was replaced by a small, stubborn ember of defiance. They could take his house, they could cast him out, but he would not let them harm his kin. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below, would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Hal Critch wasn't finished yet, and neither was the warlord hunting Gaza. The final week was a blur of quiet desperation. Silas felt like a condemned man, watching the sun rise and set, each cycle bringing his eviction one day closer. The villagers left them alone now, their initial, fearful anger replaced by a cold, shunning silence. When Silas had to venture to the village well for water, they would turn their backs, mothers pulling their children away as if he were afflicted with a plague. He was no longer just the town debtor. He was the orc friend, a title spat like a curse. Inside the hovel, a strange new domesticity had settled. Garza's leg was healing rapidly, her robust physiology knitting flesh and sinew back together with astonishing speed. She was now able to move without a limp, her full strength returning. She took over the task of foraging, her knowledge of the forest providing them with a steady supply of food. She taught Silas how to identify the sweet inner bark of the pine tree and how to track game not by sight, but by the subtle language of broken twigs and disturbed earth. Grok, in this quiet space, began to emerge from his shell. He would follow Silas around the hovel, mimicking his movements as he mended his nets. One evening, as Silas sat carving a small piece of wood, a habit he'd picked up to keep his hands busy, Grok uttered his first word. Silas had been trying to carve a wolf, but it looked more like a lopsided dog. He sighed in frustration. "Wolf," a small, gruff voice said beside him. Silas turned, stunned. Grok was pointing at the carving with a small, green finger. "Wolf," he repeated, his pronunciation thick but clear. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, the first genuine smile in days. "Yes, Arceus," he said. "Wolf." From then on, Grok began to speak in hesitant, single words. Fire. Water. Bread. Each word was a small victory, a tiny seed of trust taking root in the barren soil of their predicament. On the 6th day, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. A storm was rolling in from the north, an oppressive mass of clouds that swallowed the light and brought a biting, unnatural chill. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful sound that seemed to sync with the anxiety in Silas's chest. This was it, the last day. Tomorrow, Critch would come. The storm broke just after dusk, a furious deluge that hammered against their newly repaired roof. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the hovel. It was a wild, primal storm, as if the world itself were in a rage. And in the heart of that storm, they came. There was a sound from the village, a sound distinct from the thunder. It was the panicked braying of a donkey, followed by a human shout cut short. Gaza was on her feet in an instant, her body coiled like a spring. Her hand gripping the hilt of the long, wicked-looking blade she kept hidden in her bedding. "They are here," she whispered, and Silas knew she didn't mean Critch. Her eyes were fixed on the door. Her nostrils flared as if she could scent her enemies on the wind. "Thrathrak!" The name hung in the air, a promise of violence. Silas's blood ran cold. He had dreaded Critch and his eviction notice, a bureaucratic end to his life. This was something else entirely. This was a bloody, violent end. He grabbed his wood axe, the handle slick in his sweaty palm. It felt pathetic, a child's toy against the coming threat. He moved to stand beside Garza, his shoulder brushing against her arm. He was terrified, a deep, trembling fear that made his teeth ache. But he stood his ground. He would not hide while his family was threatened. They waited in the suffocating silence between thunderclaps. Then they heard it. Heavy, booted footsteps squelching through the mud, approaching the hovel. Not the shuffling feet of villagers, or the pompous tread of Hal Critch. This was the confident, heavy stride of warriors. A fist hammered on the door, a blow so hard the wood splintered. "Deserter!" a voice roared, a guttural bellow that was barely human. "I know you are in there. Come out and face your judgment, or we will burn this shack to the ground with you in it." Garza's knuckles were white on the hilt of her sword. "That is Thrathrak," she breathed, her voice tight with a mixture of hatred and dread. Before Silas could respond, another voice cut through the storm, this one reedy and furious. "What in the blazes is the meaning of this? This is private property. You there! Unhand that door!" Silas peered through a crack in the boarded window. In the chaotic flashes of lightning, he saw an impossible scene. Thrathrak's skull render, a mountain of an orc clad in black iron and cruel spikes, stood before his door. He was flanked by two other orcs, both scarred and heavily armed, their faces twisted into brutish sneers. And standing before them, looking like a furious, sputtering gnome, was Howl Critch. He held his ledger to his chest like a shield, his two hired thugs looking decidedly nervous behind him. "This hovel and the land it sits on are under my purview," Critch squeaked, his fear making him reckless. "And the tenant, Silas Thorne, is to be evicted this morning. I have the papers right here." Thrathrak turned his massive head and gave Critch a look of utter contempt. With a casual backhand, he sent the landlord tumbling into the mud. The ledger flew from his hands, its pages scattering in the wind and rain. "The only law here is mine," Thrathrak growled. He turned back to the door. "Last chance, Garza." This was it. The crisis. The convergence of all his fears at his very doorstep. The warlord who wanted blood and the landlord who wanted his home. Both of them monsters in their own right. Silas looked at Garza. He saw the fire in her eyes, the warrior ready to die fighting. He looked at Grok, who was huddled behind his mother, his small face a mask of terror. And the fear in Silas's own heart burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He took a deep breath, walked to the door, and unlatched it. He opened it and stepped out into the storm. The rain plastered his thin shirt to his body instantly. He stood there, a frail, unassuming figure, between the monstrous warlord and the sputtering landlord with the terrified eyes of the entire village watching from a distance. "You will not touch them," Silas said. His voice didn't tremble. It was quiet, but it cut through the wind. Thrathrak laughed, a horrible, grinding sound. "And who are you, little man, to tell me what I will and will not do?" "He's a debtor!" Critch shrieked from the mud, scrambling to gather the ruined pages of his ledger. "A nobody! The house is mine!" Silas ignored Critch. He looked directly at Thrathrak, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel like a weakling. "You speak of judgment," Silas said, his voice gaining strength. "You hunt her for being a deserter. You call her a debtor to the laws of your clan." He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Critch. "And you hunt me for a debt coin. A debt I never made. Passed down like a curse, you both use debt as a weapon. You use it to claim power, to take what isn't yours, to crush those you deem lesser than yourselves." A flash of lightning illuminated his pale, determined face. "But there are other debts. There is a debt of kindness, a debt of honor." He pointed a trembling finger at Garza, who now stood in the doorway behind him, her sword in her hand. "When my roof leaked, she fixed it. When my larder was empty, she filled it. When my heart was full of despair, she called me kin." He turned his fiery gaze back to Thrathrak. "She has more honor in her wounded leg than you have in your entire body. You are the one who is bankrupt. You are the debtor to your own people." The villagers, who had crept closer, listened in stunned silence. They had never heard Silas Thorne speak more than a few mumbled words. They had never seen this fire in him. Thrathrak's face contorted in fury. He raised his massive, spiked club. "I have had enough of your chirping, little bird." But before he could take a step, Garza moved. She strode past Silas, her movement fluid and powerful. She was no longer a refugee. She was a warrior queen. She planted the tip of her blade in the muddy ground before her, a formal challenge. "Thrathrak," she said, and her voice rang with an authority that silenced the storm. She spoke in the Orcish tongue, a language of harsh, powerful syllables. The words were a formal accusation, a challenge of leadership, a condemnation of his dishonor for all to hear. Thrathrak sneered, replying in the same tongue, his words dripping with scorn. He called her a coward, a traitor who consorted with weak-willed humans. It was then that Gaza made her move. But she didn't attack. She reached into a hidden pouch at her belt, one Silas had never seen before. She pulled out a heavy oilskin bag, sealed with a crest of carved bone and dark metal. The sigil of the Bloodtusk clan. With a powerful throw, she didn't toss it at Critch or Thrathrak. She hurled it into the center of the stunned crowd of villagers. It landed with a heavy, wet thud at the feet of the village elder, a man named Elric. "There are debts to be paid," Gaza declared, her voice now in the common tongue, ringing with power. "Let them be paid in full." Thrathrak froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He recognized the pouch. Hesitantly, Elric the Elder knelt and fumbled with the ties. He opened the bag and gasped. The contents spilled out into the mud. It was not just a bag of gold. There were heavy, ancient Orcish coins, yes, shimmering even in the dim light. But there was more. There were ceremonial bracelets of polished tusk, a ring bearing a massive, uncut ruby, and something else, something heavy and magnificent. Elric lifted it. It was a torque, a heavy neck ring of twisted silver and obsidian, the unmistakable chieftain's torque of the Bloodtusk clan. An artifact of immense power and significance. "She is..." Elric stammered, his eyes wide with awe. "I am Gaza, daughter of Gal, rightful chieftain of the Bloodtusk clan," she proclaimed, her voice echoing through the village. "Exiled by the treachery of this usurper." She pointed her sword at Thrathrak. "My presence here with the torque is proof of my claim. His bounty was a lie to secure his stolen throne." The golden artifacts lying in the mud were worth a king's ransom, more than enough to pay Silas's debt 100 times over. But their value was more than monetary. They were proof of her identity, her status, her honor. Thrathrak's face went pale under his brutish features. His entire claim to power was built on the lie of Gaza's dishonor. Her public display, her willingness to part with her clan's treasures to settle a human's petty debt, was the ultimate act of chieftain's honor. It shattered his narrative completely. His two warriors looked from the talk to Gaza, and then to Thrathrak. Doubt was plain on their faces. They served the strong, but they revered the ancient laws of honor. Thrathrak was strong, but Gaza now held the symbol of legitimate rule. "Lies!" Thrathrak roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He lunged not at Gaza but at Silas, the source of his humiliation. He never reached him. With a speed that defied her size, Gaza intercepted the blow. Her blade met his club with a shower of sparks and a clang that resonated like a death knell. The battle for the Bloodtusk clan had begun, right there in the mud and rain of Blackwood village. The duel was brutal and swift. Thrathrak fought with wild, furious strength, his spiked club a whirlwind of death. But Gaza was his superior. She fought not with rage, but with cold, precise skill. Her movements were a dance of deadly grace, her blade weaving a pattern of defense and attack. She was a master, and he was a thug. She parried a crushing overhead blow, twisted under his arm, and slammed the pommel of her sword into the back of his knee. His leg buckled, and he roared in pain. As he stumbled, she disarmed him with a flick of her wrist, sending his club flying into the darkness. She placed the tip of her sword against his throat. Silence. The only sounds were the rain and Thrathrak's ragged, panicked breathing. He was defeated, utterly and publicly humiliated. "You are not worthy to lead the Bloodtusk," Gaza said, her voice cold as ice. "You have no honor." She did not kill him. Killing him there would have been an execution, not a victory. She lowered her sword. "Leave. Tell our people what you saw here. Tell them their chieftain lives, and that she keeps her promises." Thrathrak scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure hatred and shame. He gave one last venomous glare at Gaza, at Silas, and at the watching villagers. Then, without his weapon, without his authority, he turned and fled into the darkness of the forest, a broken warlord. His two warriors hesitated for a moment. Then, after a brief, respectful nod to Gaza, they followed their disgraced leader into the night. The immediate aftermath was a stunned silence, broken only by the patter of the rain. The threat was gone. The storm, both literal and figurative, had broken. All eyes turned to the other villain of the piece. Howell Critch was on his hands and knees in the mud, frantically trying to salvage the scattered, soaked pages of his precious ledger. He looked up, his face a comical mixture of fear and greed. His eyes were locked on the pile of treasure at the elder's feet. "The debt," he stammered, crawling forward. "The debt must be paid. That is rightfully mine." He reached a grasping hand toward the gleaming torque, but a heavy boot planted itself firmly on his wrist. It was Elric, the village elder. His face, usually placid and non-committal, was hard as stone. "Enough, Critch," Elric said, his voice firm. "You have preyed on the misfortune of this village for too long. This is a matter of honor now, not your grubby numbers." Elric looked at Silas, then at Gaza. He bent down and picked up a handful of the heavy gold coins. He walked over to Silas and pressed them into his hand. "Your debt is paid, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And then some." Silas looked down at the gold in his palm. It felt impossibly heavy. It was the weight of freedom. He walked over to Critch, who was still pinned under Elric's boot, and opened his hand. The coins fell into the mud at Critch's feet. 482 silver, Silas said, his voice clear and steady. "Consider it paid, in gold." He then took one more coin from his pocket, a small copper piece, his last coin in the world. He flicked it onto the pile. "And that's for the damage to my door." Critch stared at the gold, his eyes wide with a manic gleam, but no one moved to help him. The villagers, who had feared and loathed him for years, simply watched him with cold contempt. He was a king with no subjects, a predator with no teeth. Silas turned away from him. He walked to the door of his hovel, the place that was now, truly, his home. He reached for the rusty key that hung on the nail beside the doorframe. His fingers closed around it. For his entire life, this key had been a lie, a symbol of a home he only occupied at the mercy of another man. He took the key, walked to the front door, and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. He locked his own door, then he unlocked it. A small, simple act, but it was everything. It was ownership, it was security, it was a future. Gaza came to stand beside him, Grok clinging to her leg. She looked at the small, determined man who had changed her fate. "You did not run, Silas Thorne." "Neither did you," he replied, a small smile on his face. "Welcome home." The days that followed were a time of miraculous change. The story of the confrontation in the rain spread through Blackwood and the surrounding farms like a cleansing fire. The story of the weak, indebted Silas Thorne standing up to a warlord. The story of the Orc chieftain who paid a human's debt as a matter of honor. Howell Critch, disgraced and ostracized, sold his ledgers and properties for a fraction of their worth and left town, unable to bear the weight of 100 scornful glares. The cloud of hereditary debt that had hung over half the families in Blackwood for generations simply evaporated. With a portion of the immense treasure, Silas not only secured the deed to his house and the surrounding woods, but had enough to begin rebuilding. The villagers, their fear replaced by a profound respect and a healthy dose of awe, came to help. The baker, who had once shunned him, now brought fresh bread every morning, not as charity, but as a gift for the town's unlikely hero. The blacksmith offered to forge new hinges for his door, free of charge. The wall of prejudice that had surrounded Silas and his hovel had not just been cracked, it had been torn down. The house was transformed. The roof was properly shingled. A new room was added, built with sturdy oak and happy hands. A real glass window was fitted, letting in the morning light. The larder, once a symbol of his gnawing hunger, was now stocked to bursting with smoked meats, sacks of flour, and jars of preserved vegetables, gifts from his new friends. Gaza did not leave. The news of Thrathrak's disgrace would travel fast in the York territory. Her clan would be in turmoil, but she knew that rushing back would mean more bloodshed. She chose for now to stay. To let her son have a taste of peace. To let him learn the word friend as well as wolf. She became a quiet, powerful presence in the village. She taught them which mushrooms were safe, where to find the best clay for pottery, and how to set a fence post so deep that no winter frost could move it. The children, once terrified, now followed her at a safe distance, their fear replaced by a wide-eyed curiosity. They would watch as she and Silas worked together in their garden, a strange and wonderful sight. The towering orc chieftain and the small, kind-hearted man, turning the soil for a new season. One evening, they sat on the newly built porch of their home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Grok was asleep inside, tucked into a warm, soft bed of his own. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. A comfortable silence settled between them. "You could have taken all of it," Silas said quietly, breaking the silence. "The treasure. You could have used it to hire an army to take back your throne immediately." Gaza watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. "An army bought with gold is loyal only to the gold," she said. "A throne taken with blood is forever stained by it. You taught me something, Silas Thorne. True strength is not in the sword arm. It is in the heart that chooses to shield another." She looked at him, her craggy features softened by the twilight. "My home is with my clan. One day I will return. But what you have built here, this peace, this is a rare and precious thing. This is a home too." Silas looked out at the lights of the village, no longer a place of fear and judgment, but a community he was a part of. He looked at his house no longer a shack, but a home filled with warmth and food and family. He thought of the rusty key, now polished and sitting on his mantle, a reminder that the most worthless-seeming things can sometimes unlock the greatest treasures. And that is how a poor human and an orc chieftain proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.